Hey guys, Rick Stone here from Stoney Acres Gardening. Welcome to my channel. Today we're going to be talking about things that you can be planting during the month of April. Before we get started, please make sure you get subscribed to my channel and click that notification bell so you get noticed every time I release new videos, which is about once or twice a week. The other thing I wanted to point out to you, we've got a fun free workshop coming up on April 19th about spring planting, and there is a link in the description of this video you can click on to get signed up for that. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about April planting, and this video is designed for those of you that live in areas where your last frost date is somewhere between early April and mid-May, okay? Probably that means you live in zones 5 or 6, but your garden zone is not that important. Your frost date is the important thing that we are worried about when we're talking about April planting, okay? So the first thing that you can be planting in your garden during the month of April is some of the cool season herbs. So here we're talking about things like chives or cilantro or parsley. Any of those are hardy. They're going to do really well planted this time of the year, so you can go ahead and get those planted out in your garden either by transplant or by seed if you want, directly sown in your garden. Next on the list is your brassicas. So the brassica family includes things like cabbage, cauliflower, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, kohlrabi. All of those are really going to do well planted this time of the year. So these are cool season crops, and they would really prefer to be planted somewhere between 3 to 4 weeks before your last frost date, okay? So they're going to stand up to frost. They're going to stand up to snow if it happens to have a freak late snowstorm. They're going to be fine, and you need to get them out in the garden so that they're developing and growing so that they're ready to harvest fairly early in the season. We want those plants to be ready to harvest in June before the really, really hot weather shows up. So we definitely need to be getting those guys in the garden now in April, as soon as you can, okay? Next on the list would be your leafy greens. And so with leafy greens, we're talking here about lettuce, arugula, spinach, Swiss chard, kale, collards, any of those, Asian greens, mustards. All of those are going to do really well planted this time of the year. They're cool season crops. They're going to stand up to the frost. You can start planting them direct seeded in your garden about 4 weeks before your last frost date, all the way up until 2 or 3 weeks after your last frost date. So there's a big window. You can plant those directly sown, or if you've got transplants, you can put those in as well. Again, very hardy. They're going to stand up to the cold. Go ahead and get them in before your last frost date, okay? Next is the root crops. So here we're talking about carrots, radishes, turnips, beets, onions, and leeks, okay? All of those need to be planted ASAP. You want to get those in while the weather is cool. They're going to grow and develop in the cool weather so that, again, they start to mature in June for all of the root crops. Onions, obviously, and leeks are going to be a little bit longer than that, but we want them in now so that they can do their growing in the cool time of the year and they're ready to harvest before the hot summer weather comes. If you haven't planted your onions yet, you definitely need to get those guys in. And those you're going to plant by transplant this time of year or by sets, okay? With the root crops, we're always going to direct sow those. So just go ahead and get them direct sown in your garden ASAP. Next on the list is potatoes. So potatoes are one of those kind of quasi cool season, warm season crops. They kind of bridge that gap. You can get them planted 3 or 4 weeks before your last frost date, and they're going to be fine. Now, just keep in mind that you may, if you have a late frost sometime in late, April or early May, you might have to go out and throw some covers over those just to protect them a little bit. But they're actually pretty hardy. That, especially might be the case if you've got some potatoes that have already chitted, so they've already started to sprout. Those are going to come up rather quickly in the garden, and so you might want to be prepared to cover those guys up. But 4 weeks before your last frost date is perfect timing for potatoes. The nice thing about potatoes is you've got a big window, so you can plant 4 weeks before your last frost date all the way up until about 4 weeks after your last frost date. So there's a whole 2 months where you can actually be growing those potatoes, planting those potatoes in your garden. Oh, one other thing that I didn't mention was peas. If you haven't planted your peas yet, you're not too late. So you can get your peas in. We've got ours in. They're just coming up now. They've been in for about 2 weeks, and we're just starting to see them come out of the ground. but it's still time to plant peas. You know, especially if you haven't had your last frost date yet, you've got plenty of time for those peas as well. Last on the list is tomatoes, okay? Now I know you guys are going, what? Wait a minute, I haven't had my last frost. That's okay, if you have a little equipment for it, okay? So these are what we call wall of waters or maybe cozy coats. We'll see them under both of those brand names. These are season extenders. They're actually water-filled clotches that you can plant your tomatoes early directly out in the garden. So I have planted as much as 6 weeks before my last frost, but I've been very successful planting tomatoes in wall of waters 4 weeks before my last frost date, and we have just been perfectly fine. That actually is the only way I can have tomatoes by the 4th of July, is if I put some tomatoes out in these wall of waters. Now, I don't plant all of my tomatoes in wall of waters, just in case we have some freakish, you know, super freezing cold temperatures. I don't want to lose all my tomatoes, but these wall of waters are going to support your tomatoes in temperatures all the way down to like 25 degrees. They're going to be just fine, and so this is a great way to cheat and get your tomatoes going a little bit sooner. So if you've got some tomato starts that are ready to go out in the garden now, buy yourself a couple of these wall of waters, or Cozy Coats is another name brand they go by, and get those in your garden now, and you are going to be super happy. Now, what about planting inside? Are there still some things that we could be planting indoors to transplant out in the garden later? And yes, there is. That would be mostly your tomato family. So tomatoes, peppers, tomatillos, eggplant, all of those you can still get started. Any of your herbs, your warm season herbs like basil or oregano, all of those you can still get started indoors so that they'll be ready to transplant out in a few weeks. The other thing that you might want to consider is squash plants. So if you live somewhere where you have some chaotic weather, maybe you have a relatively short growing season, you could be doing the squash family as well. So here we're talking about summer squashes, winter squashes, melons, and cucumbers, okay? All of those now is the perfect time if you want to start those indoors. Now, you don't have to start them indoors. They do really well direct seeded in the garden, but if you feel like that you need to be starting them indoors, now is the time to do that, about 3 weeks before your last frost date. We don't want really big vining plants when we transplant out into the garden. Squash family plants don't transplant very well, so we want a relatively small, healthy plant with maybe only 2 or 3 leaves, which means we only want them to be about 3 to maybe at the most 4 weeks old before we put them out in the garden. If you're going to start those indoors, I would recommend that you use a pot that you can just stick in the ground. So like a newspaper pot, maybe the soil blocks, or like a peat or cocoa coir based pot. That way you can just take them out, stick them straight in the ground. You disturb the roots less when you're doing that transplanting. So now is the time if you want to get those started indoors to do that. But again, we only want about 3 weeks before we plant them out in the garden. So fun time of year. We love spring. We love all of the planting that we get to do, all of the fun stuff that we get to do in our garden during the month of April. So this is a big month, almost as big as May. May is kind of maybe the biggest month for us in our garden, but April is a big one too. So get out and get your garden planted. Now, before we go, I did want to mention just really quickly about this workshop that we have coming up. So it's a spring planting workshop. It's going to be on April 19th at 2 p.m. Mountain Time. This is going to be kind of a private workshop, so you have to register for it. We're looking for about 250 people to join it. It's free. We're going to talk about 3 different topics. We're going to talk about warm versus cold season. We're going to talk about the transplants versus direct sowing, and then we're going to talk about succession planting and how you can extend your harvest, how you can boost the amount of stuff that you're growing by using succession planting in your garden. So those are the 3 topics we're going to cover. After I've covered those, probably half hour to 40 minutes, we'll cover those. We'll give away a couple of prizes, and then we are going to do a Q&A as well. So we'll probably be an hour and 10 minutes on this free workshop. And you do need to register for it though, because we're going to host it on a private platform. So I do need you to register for it. So there's a link down in the description of this video you can click on to get signed up for that. Again, April 19th, 2 p.m. Mountain Time. And yes, it is going to be recorded. So if you can't make it at that time, it will be available for about a week afterwards as well for you to watch. So, but again, you need to be signed up for it. So you need to get registered. All I need is your first name and your email address. You can just click that link down below and get signed up for that webinar, okay? All right, it's gonna be a lot of fun. That's all I have for you for this week. Everybody have a fantastic week. Get out in the garden and get planting. Happy gardening.